What a roller coaster. Last 2 years have been for everybody. I'm delighted to be back here. It's lovely to be back in this environment. I spoke here 2 years ago and a few years before that. And things have changed a lot in that period of time for everybody, not only in terms of how we work, but where we work. And it's those environments and it's that shifting nature of learning that learning and development as part of the organisation is trying to keep up with. Interestingly, 2-3 years ago, we were talking about how technology is moving much more towards personalisation, much more focused on the individualisation of learning, but this doesn't seem to have a push, a drive. I think what's interesting has been the changes that have happened in the last 18 months have started to drive some of those changes in technologies, as well as the behaviours that we're seeing from learners, which is the key bit. It's a bit like a perfect storm. We've had the technology, and now we're starting to see shifts in how learners are responding to changing the work environments and the changing uses of those technologies. So for the next half an hour, that's what I'm going to talk about. So hopefully that's why you're here. If you're not here to, I don't know, learn something else about another platform, but hopefully, as I say, share some insight, share some thoughts, maybe give you some food to take away to have a think about. So what I'd like to start off by thinking of, is the role that learning and development plays and has played in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and how we as learning and development professionals have built our structures, our processes, our interventions around the management and the control of learning. The power has sat with us, and rightly so. You know, we're the ones who understand learning needs. We work with learners and organisations to work that, to codify that, to create the learning opportunities. But what we're seeing now is this shift, this move away from that to this consumerisation, to this individualisation of learning, not because we're telling people that's what they need to do, but because that's what learners are doing. That's how they're behaving. That's what we're seeing culturally happen within organisations in the workplace. How does learning and development respond to that change? How do we shift our thinking about that change? We've done some surveys. We've done some very quick, brief surveys of some of our clients over the last 2 years. And within this presentation, I'm going to share some of those findings. So we asked a few questions, some probably no-brainer questions in terms of the answers, but interesting nonetheless. So we asked this question. What's the success to striking the balance, and how are organisations finding that striking that balance, and is the key getting the balance right between formal and informal learning? Clearly, everybody in the main, 97% of people, think that is absolutely vital. Getting the balance between formal and informal. 3% said it's not. We didn't ask that 3% why not, which would be probably quite interesting follow on. But 97% think it is right. No real surprise, considering that formal learning structures have been around since before the time of the Industrial Revolution. Informal learning structures have been around forever. We learn informally. But I think what's happening now, interestingly, is technology is driving that combination together. And it's how do we respond to the changing behaviour that we're seeing from learners, and also how do we use the technologies that are around us to enable that and to make that happen. Next question we asked, should L&D be should be more integrated into the workplace? Should it be part of workplace departments? 100% said yes. 100% of people agreed that it needs to be part of internal organisations. What does that mean? I mean, again, some more follow-on questions for me. Well, what does that look like for you? Does that mean a change in identity for L&D? Does that mean you could become business partners, consultants? Or is it about actually recognising the shift and the change that are happening in the workplace around where learning's taking place? And do we need as L&D to be more aware of that and understand that more deeply by being closer to the workplace? We can't afford necessarily to be outside where work is happening. If you believe in the movement towards learning in the flow and consumerisation, which is happening, then L&D's role, its identity, needs to shift and start to move towards doing that. That's my interpretation. Finally, final question. Hybrid working. Has hybrid working had an impact on how people, how learning's been supported? And overwhelmingly again, it has. Interestingly, I think the people that disagree, it would be interesting to know actually what were they doing beforehand? Were they doing something which was the same before? Because this isn't new. Hybrid working, digital working isn't new. It's not all of a sudden changed. You know, the last 12 months, 18 months haven't changed how we're doing it. It's accelerated things, it's driven things, but it hasn't changed things. All we're doing now is starting to understand that we have to get on board with it, and we have to be fully embracing of the digital learning technologies and how to use them better. So the questions that we're asking as learning and development professionals is not about, well, what content do we do and how do we do it and how do we package it, but it's how do we deliver it, how do we support the interface between learning and the learner, how do we enable that to make it a smooth, seamless process. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit about that. We'll skip that one. So what have we noticed? From the learner's perspective, what have we noticed? Learners' experiences are changing. Their needs are changing. How they want to learn is changing. Not wholesale, not everything. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But learners are becoming more consumer-led. They're behaving a lot more like consumers in the workplace and acting like that. And they want their learning to be supported in that way. So it's not changing the packaging necessarily, but it's changing the approach. It's changing how you interface, how you engage, how you enable. It's about striking an effective learning culture, finding the right balance between focused, program-led learning, which is still valuable, which is absolutely valuable, but also informal learning. How do you build that so it becomes culturally something that people do all the time, or recognize that that's what they're doing all the time? Even if it's not banned and billed as a learning experience, and it's a pocket piece of knowledge, it's a little bit of content, it's a little bit of an aid, how do people actually see that as being part of the learning process? Digital and being digital is not just about e-learning. It isn't just about a 45-minute chunk of e-learning and it's done. Digital is much wider than that now. We're starting to talk about assets. We're starting to talk about how do we actually build an asset group which we can then use and apply in multiple contexts, multiple settings, with multiple different users. We can't afford to keep building e-learning after e-learning after e-learning. E-learning is great, but it only fills a niche, and it's only part of the whole picture. Accessibility, how do people access? And this isn't just about mobile, it's about actually thinking around how do people access it, but also in terms of needs, learning needs of individuals, both from a physical point of view and also other needs that exist. And learner first, making sure that the learner truly is the first point of consideration. So we're less talking about content and much more about how. We did a round table with Kathy Hoy last year, which is on the Virtual College website, and she offered 3 pieces of advice to the L&D community when it comes to thinking about how do you construct learning and learning strategy. She said, and we agree, learning has to be compelling. You have to draw people to the message. It has to understand what it is and how they get it and what it is that they want to learn. It needs to be constructive, so it needs to fulfill a need. It needs to look at helping them do something, build something, move on from something, acquire something that they need. It needs to be convenient. It needs to be something that will reflect what they're doing, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it. So you need to think about the working patterns of learners and the environments that they're working in and how they're accessing the learning that they're taking part in. The learner's view. We did a survey and we asked 2,000 learners, and these are virtual college learners. We asked 2,000 learners in the workplace what it is that they want from their learning, what their expectations do they bring to it. we boiled that down into these 4 key points, which we think are really insightful and really helpful, and we use them when we're talking to clients about how to build learning strategy and what they're looking to do. Freedom to learn at a time and a place that suits them. So it's not just saying that program structured learning is important, it's about saying they have choice within the space and time that they can do it. Flexibility to learn in the flow of work if they choose to. So flexibility to be able to take the content that you're preserving and giving to them and apply it in a way that makes sense for them, at a context that makes sense for them. More control over their journey. So yes, learner journeys are important, pathways are important, ensuring that there's clear learning outcomes and clear learning goals are important. And any organisation would not reject that. But what learners want is to ensure that those learner journeys they have some control over the pace, the time, the process that they're taking part in. And learning is constructive and have a purpose. So echoing what Kathy Hoy said, it's about saying that actually it builds on something, it creates something, and it gives them a purpose and a reason for doing it, which is usually, they've got a job, they want to grow within that job and they want to move on within that job. Does your learning help them do that? Does it help them do their job better? So the future is shifting, and we are seeing much more of what we would class as consumer-based learning. So apologies for a little bit of learning theory. I can't resist coming to something like this and not doing a little bit of learning theory. But what we've noticed probably over the last, let's say it, 70, 80 years, is a shift away from the classic pedagogical structures of learning towards a word which I love saying. I feel like a small child learning a new word when I say it, the heutagogical approach to learning, which is where learners have much more control, have much more ability to make their own decisions within a framework. The bit in the middle, the andragogical support, is where the facilitator, the teacher, the learning organisation still structures that. And what we're seeing through consumerisation is this shift towards this heutagogy, is a shift towards much more learner-centric, true learner-centric learning. And thinking about, do our structures, do our strategies, our policies, the way that we actually deliver learning, reflect this? Because if we're sat in a pedagogical world where we're delivering content, even be it in an e-learning context, it's going to fall short of those changing learner expectations. And I'm not saying that everything becomes heutagogical and we become this true autocracy of learning where anything goes, because that's not realistic, or it's not really intelligent. But what I'm saying is that how do we structure our learning to reflect that greater choice, that greater ability to help learners make choices for themselves? So this sort of talks towards learning in the flow, and it talks very much about what learning in the flow realistically is all about. It is about the technology, and it is about the technology that drives learning in the flow. And of course, if you look at Microsoft Viva and things like that, which are clearly geared up towards delivering that, it's the underpinning culture, it's the underpinning strategies that underpin learning, and our approach to learning as L&D, which will drive it. How do we equip our businesses and our learners to be more heutagogical? Because the reality of it is that their expectations may still be that learning is something that you do and is done to you, regardless of the behaviours that are demonstrating day to day. What we've got to try and do is be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of that and start delivering learning in a different way, which is breaking it down into assets, which is thinking more intelligently about how we serve the content that we build. So, client's view. Very, very quickly, echoes a lot of the points that we've been talking about already. So our clients, when we're talking to them, and what we're seeing coming through the door in terms of what people want from us, is thinking about different ways of delivery. So they don't just want e-learning, they want to think differently about how they structure programs. They want to look at micro-learning, but in an intelligent way, not in a silver bullet way, but in a way, how do I take what I'm doing and break it down? How do I turn it into micro assets that can be used in multiple contexts? They want to think about this standalone. They want to sweat the assets they're building. So, I'm not being disrespectful to learning, but I'm saying, actually, if I'm going to spend this money on developing video, I'm going to go out and do a lot of live action video, and it costs a lot of money to do that. Do I want to embed it in a piece of e-learning that will get 1 or 2 hits, or do I want to think about how do I use that learning in multiple different ways, in multiple different contexts? How do I package that? How do I code that so it can be searched on? How do I put names next to that? How do I keyword it? So it's thinking differently about the assets that people are building, and building that into not just their content strategy, but their delivery strategy as well. So how does the platforms that they're working with support that? So it's not just about hosting it, it's about thinking, well, what is the learner's behaviours going to be around that? Greater integration of those digital assets, just talked about, true digital blending, and the curation word. Interestingly, in Donald Taylor's GSS this year, curation's dropping down the list. And I keep scratching my head. I'm wondering why. Because we're talking about learning in the flow, we're talking about creating digital libraries of assets, yet curation as a big thing is disappearing. What's going on? Is there a disconnect between what people actually see and what's happening, or actually is it just a myth? Is curation and learning in the flow real? Just another myth? I'm not sure yet. Time will tell. But I argue that as learning and development, we need to be serious about curation. We need to think about it seriously as a skill set within our teams. How do you curate content? How do you build libraries of resources that people can access? You can't control everything. We can't control the internet. But curation is slipping down. We have to be aware of that. So this echoes a presentation of this sort here wouldn't be complete without a little bit of Josh Bursing. So apologies for putting a bit of Josh in here. So Josh came up with this 2017. So it's getting on now. But his theory and his thinking around learning in the flow, to me, it's pretty solid. When I look at it and I think about what we're getting told now by our clients, what we're seeing from our learners, and what we're experiencing and what we're hearing from other experts in the field, is that this model, which I think is a really good and clear example of what a good learning in the flow strategy could be, demonstrates that. So it talks about chunks of macro learning associated and pulled together with a program, which is fine because we still need that. But associated to that is micro learning in the flow, bite size, which is aligned to those learning needs of those learning groups. So it's not moving dramatically towards this heutagogical approach. It's saying that actually where we are is you need to provide people with a framework and a structure, still need to do that. But what we should be thinking about is when they're going away from their formal learning and they're embedding it in their practice, how do we keep feeding that? How do we keep throwing that content at them to keep it going in? So it helps embed, it helps people make sense of it, contextualize it. We can get smart, we can start to look at how do we search on that, we can start to look at AI, we can start to look at different algorithms associated with different job titles, so on and so forth. We get into silver bullet territory again. But the reality of it is, when you're thinking about learning and thinking about structuring learning, I actually think this is realistic. To start to think, how do you use your assets differently? How do you use your platforms differently to deliver that? How do you structure the learning itself to deliver that? So certainly worth considering when thinking about what learning in the flow is really about, how people's attitudes towards learning is changing and has changed over the last 12 months. So what challenges do you face? Well, I mean, I'm probably, everybody, if we do a poll in here, and I'm not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to do one of those cringy moments where I ask people to interact or anything like that, because I know how painful it is. So if I was to ask, I suspect some of these challenges would be the same challenges that you're thinking about and you're facing. Not all of them, maybe, but they're the sorts of challenges that L&D, modern L&D is having to deal with. Getting to grip with what actually it means to be digital, and what does that mean for your organisation? And not just organisation with a big O, But what does it mean for your organisation in terms of L&D? How do you deliver? What does it mean for you as individuals within it? You know, do you class yourself as being digital savvy or not digital savvy? What does it mean to be a partner within the business? What does it really mean to be embedded within your organisation? What does that look like? Or are you just there still providing service? Are you still there providing an order filling role? Or actually are you providing intelligent assets which are helping people learn where they need it at the point of need? So what is your relationship and your role within that? How do you genuinely put the learner first when it comes to learning design? And thinking about the learning design and the approach that you take to building content but also delivering content. Data, the big word of a couple of years ago at least, learning data. And it's a word we throw around, but in reality, everyone's still a little bit scared of it, everyone's still a little bit worried about how we do it. Evaluation data, impact data, what does it mean? And actually quite quickly when you scratch under the surface, it's really hard. And it's really hard to get right. But what data can you access? What data does your LMS give you? Can you use it intelligently? You know, that's probably the first question that any L&D team should be asking is what data does my LMS, the thing I'm using day in, day out, give me? And do I use it? And if I don't use it, how can I use it better? So ask yourself some simple questions. And if you don't know, find out. Get someone to help you structure that data in a way which becomes meaningful for your business. You don't have to, you know, go out and buy a massive, you know, data resource base and all the things that go with it. Just do the basics first. So I don't mean to lecture. Data's for me, I love data and I'm really into the whole concept of it, but I really struggle with how to do it. I really struggle with the whole process of it and how unsophisticated we are as L&D in terms of taking learner data and learner behaviours and turning it into insight. And I think we can do an awful lot more about that. And stop, I know this has been said many, many times, stop coming to events like this and looking to technology to fight for the silver bullet, because it doesn't exist. It never will exist. The only silver bullet is what you do and how you do it. That's the only silver bullet. This stuff is here to help. This stuff is here to enable and getting beneath the surface of how it works. It's not the answer. So, without boring you too much, and I've got another few slides that I want to share, I just want to share a little bit about a real case study, something that we've done recently with a client when they've come along with some of the questions that you've asked, and some of the practically, how do I take a program, a course, and turn it into something which is more bite-sized, which is more asset-driven, which is much more reflective of the change in learner expectations and behaviours. And this is the process that we followed. So I just wanted to share this just as an example. I'm not saying this is learning in the flow. I'm not saying this is the perfect solution. I just wanted to share you and give you an insight into how we're approaching this in a live context with live clients. We use the principle of human-centered design in terms of our approach and how we do our learning design. So the people do come first. So the first part of any discovery for us is to understand what people do, how they do it, what it looks like in the workplace, what their not so much what their learning needs are, but more about how they're going to utilise the learning to build on those building blocks that Kathy Hoy was talking about. So we use a simple process which looks at solution scoping, solution design, technology identification, and then making sure that all that information fits together. What does it look like in practice? Oh, gone too far. Sorry about that. It's probably when you use animations and you can't remember when the animation starts. Keep losing it. Okay, I need to do this because it's important. Talk amongst yourselves. There we go. It's a bit pedestrian for me. I think that's probably why I skip over it. So this was the problem. This was the brief. So a client came to us, said, learners are not engaged in the module, takes too long, it's not fit for purpose, we've changed, our learners are changing, it's the feedback that we're getting. There's too much background noise, there's too many other things going on for them. How do we get through that? How do we break that down to make it this? We've invested in this, we've designed this, but we want to change it. So this was our response to it. So it's a design-led response. It's looking at us understanding how learners work, and it's starting to think about learning in a different way. So we took one module, we started off with as a single hour. We started off by talking to the learners to understand from that module what was useful, what was not useful, what did they use the most, what had the greatest impact and resonance on their day-to-day job, which bits of the asset work better than other bits of the asset. So we started to understand some of the granular level of the learning that was happening and occurring. And unfortunately, most SCORM-based stuff doesn't give us that insight. So you have to do it manually. You have to have those sorts of conversations to do that. So from that insight, we then broke it down into a series of smaller assets. So we started to look at how do we chunk that down into small 5 to 10 minute component blocks, which, okay, some would argue isn't true micro-learning. A 10-minute block isn't the peak of micro-learning. We're not trying to follow that. We're not trying to say this is micro-learning, this is a good example. What we're saying is, here's an hour, this is how we're going to chunk it down to make it more usable, make it more fit for purpose from a learner's point of view. So we looked at breaking it down. We then started to think about what types of asset that we would use to do that, and looked at the different types of assets. Some was already there, so the stuff that was already embedded in the learning, but then other things as well. And build this out as independent assets. Yes, we could chunk it out into one program, but then actually how do you then break it down into a series of individual assets underpinning that? So it's what do those assets do to deliver those learning outcomes, those learning objectives from a micro perspective. So we've broken it down. Then the next key thing for us was the whole question of searchability, and then increasing the whole thing about searchability. So then we started to look at keywords. We started to look at how do we identify keywords from those individual learning assets against learning outcomes. How then do we put those keywords into their learning management system? So they were using Docebo. How do we use Docebo to actually deliver that? How do we place that into a way which the learner could then go in, search, and he would spit up the right asset for what they wanted when they needed it, which is the key problem. And I think if you talk to learners, that's probably one of the key issues and the key challenges when you talk about learning in the flow, is how do you search and get the right stuff, both from a quality perspective, but also from a time perspective. You know, when we're at work, you don't want people spending hours searching. You want them to put a few searches in and it come up with a few options, and those few options give them what they need. Not necessarily it's okay, you need one thing. It might be there's a choice of 5 or 6 things, but how do you create that choice so they can build that? Practical things to think about. So ask the learners what they want, first and foremost. Nod of the head. Never do that. Never talk to learners. Good God, man, who do you think you are? Talk to learners, find out what they want, but also find out how they're using things. Find out actually how they're using the content that they're getting. You know, we might be misinterpreting it, we might be thinking differently, we might be overthinking it. The reality of it is, what do they want, and are we clear about what those are? Start high level and break it down. So start at the highest point and then chunk it down as far as you can go. So start to think about it from an asset point of view. So we are thinking about global learning objectives and outcomes from a program perspective or a module perspective, but then you're chunking it down and down and down and down as far as you can go, because then that's when you get into assets. So you'll know what an asset will deliver in terms of a learning outcome. That then starts to help and inform what you then use to your search on. Chunk up the content logically. So therefore, you reverse engineering to make sure that your content then covers all your global learning outcomes. Because you can almost get a little bit too clever and then miss something. So it's important then to take it back up a level to make sure it covers all the things that you need and want it to cover. Contextualize as much as possible. Well, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. I mean, that's probably one of the key things of L&D and digital learning is how do you contextualize it. Consider searchability, as I've already talked about, really important, and probably will be the greatest hindrance and help towards digital learning. And ultimately what we're trying to do is drive engagement, improve retention of knowledge, and help people be more flexible in the learning approaches that they're adopting. So I think the whole thing about learning environments, yes, it's changing, and we've all experienced the changes. Technology isn't going to be the answer. Technology will help us adapt to that. Learning in the flow is one example of where our attitudes and our thinking around how we support learning has changed and is changing as a result of those changing working environments that we're part of. But it's not necessarily about reinventing the wheel. It's not about throwing everything out and starting again. It's about thinking smart, about thinking cleverly about the assets that you've got in a building. So on that note, I'll call it a day with a final Josh quote. Sorry, I am part of his fan club, as most people who stand in this position are. But I do like this one. The answer's not always technical, it's in our minds. It's how we use technology to support learning. That's the key question. It's not what the technology is, but it's how we use it. If we're not asking that question, then we're not using technology to its best. And you'll probably never use technology well. So on that note, I finish. I thank you for your attention. I hope it's been a useful half an hour of your lives. And you take something small away from it. Any questions? I'm more than happy with any conversations. I'm here or I'll be on our stand. So please feel free to grab me. Thank you.